Welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. So this video is going to tie in with the last one, and you might be watching this back to back. I took a little bit of a break between recording, so hopefully it ends up being a pretty smooth transition between the videos. But I'm going to take the same files that I was starting with the last time and continue off of those. So I would just recommend, and I said this at the end of the other video, that you just keep working with those or save it as a copy into a new version. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of different styles. And with the last video, it was talking a lot about white space and padding and margins and basically kind of things that you can use to kind of help organize things a little bit. Not quite to the point of thinking about layouts, but just thinking a little bit about how to kind of adjust and tweak things. And everything in this video is going to be more looking at how you can really personalize things and style things. And looking at this list, there's actually a lot of things that are specific to CSS3. So I think I'm going to actually title this CSS3 because one of your requirements for your final project is going to be that you need to apply a style that is CSS3 specific. And there's a lot of things that end up being in this section that happen to fall in line with that. That doesn't mean that everything that I'm going to talk about is necessarily a CSS3 style, but there are a lot, and I'll just kind of point out what some of those are real quick. So a lot of it tends to be things that end up looking a little bit more three-dimensional, and I think that's kind of a good way that you can kind of remember it. So I'm going to talk about box shadow and text shadow, which, if you know of like a shadow drop, is going to create this illusion of there being a shadow. And then I'm also going to talk about opacity, and opacity is where you can have something be slightly transparent. So those are going to be the key things from this section, this chapter, that are really going to fall in line with CSS3. And then there's some other things too, like being able to work with rounded corners, and I'll just kind of point those out. And in the description for the final project, I'll also talk about different things that can kind of fall in line with CSS3 in particular. And you'll encounter other things in future chapters too. There's some really cool things you can also do with really basic animation that also fall in line with that. But I just wanted to give you a bit of a heads up on that. But everything that is going to be in this video is going to be more specific to ways that you can change the aesthetics of things rather than thinking necessarily about their functional purpose. So it's really about styling. Now this is going to tie in line with content from chapter 6. And you'll see, I try to kind of go in, for the most part, in order, but there's a lot of really great examples in this chapter, and I'd really encourage you to go through and check these out. And some of them I'm going to be showing you just the exact way that the book is helping to illustrate it. And then I also do have some examples that I'm linking to on here. So this would be under week 4. So there's text shadow, box shadow examples, because I think the examples on W3 Schools is really nice for that. I also have some information here. This is going to be helpful as references for you to look at for the midterm project while you're working on that. And I don't necessarily, I'll do another video where I'll look at those in future detail, but those are mostly just to help you remember. You can think of it like a study guide, but that's not to say that there's an exam or anything. It's just going to be working on the midterm project. And then I've got some other things: hierarchy, website design, beginner's guide to wireframing, course description. So all of these things that are, the last 5 things, these are all things that are going to just help you with the midterm project, things to help you just kind of think about. So you would want to go through those on your own. And then the things that are going to be specific to this are going to be the text shadow and box shadow. And then I'm going to do one more video after the style one that is specific to the textbook content. And that's going to jump ahead to working with navigation as an unordered list. It's in chapter 7, but it's something that you have to have knowledge of to do for your midterm project. And so I'm going to cover that in a video, and then let me actually just show you this midterm project. It's going to be part of this requirement here. Navigation should be coded as an unordered list. And I've got the page on there, and I'll go over that again in the next video. I don't want to get too sidetracked from this content here. So as far as having a CSS3 style, you don't have to do that for the midterm, but you might find that there's some things that you like that are introduced in this video that you might want to be able to play around with, so that way you can personalize things and make it kind of reflect a little bit more of your style. All right, so let me open up our file again. So we have this box model, and I want to open that with the browser, and then I also want to open it in Visual Studio Code. And depending on, how you're watching these, you might have just come from watching the last one, but I want to do just a little bit of a recap of what we have, because I had introduced the box model and I started talking a little bit about how we can start turning this into a website. And that's kind of my goal with these next 2 videos, is keep working with this same general box model, but slowly turn it into more of what would be sort of a recognizable website. So that way, when you are working on your midterm, you can use these examples from class as sort of inspiration, and then you can also use your homework assignments as inspiration. So the biggest thing here was I put everything inside of a wrapper and then change the width to, I don't remember exactly, I think it's like about 70% or something. And then we use the minimum width and the maximum width to help control the size. So that way, once it reached a certain point, it wouldn't get any wider. And then once we got to a certain size with it getting more narrow, it wouldn't get any more narrow than that. So that way it's still easy to read. And then we've got the body is this light blue color, and that's something that we can kind of play around a little bit. Right now we don't really have a lot going on, but what we could do is we could take, sorry, I really like to have everything line up. Okay, let's do background. I'll just say white real quick. So this is how you could essentially build a really nice single column that's going to go the whole length of your page. And it looks a little bit weird right now because there isn't any margins going around everything. What we could do is we could add maybe just a little bit of padding, say like 10 pixels. And that just gives everything a little bit of breathing room. I think that kind of helps it look a little bit nicer. And when you are first creating a website and you're trying to figure everything out, I think adding borders around things is actually a really great idea, because then it really gives you an idea of what is padding versus what is a margin. And then it also gives you kind of an idea of how much space everything is actually taking up. So whether you keep the borders the whole time or not, I would say it's great to be able to add them just for kind of wireframing out your design and seeing everything. And then you can always remove them later. All right, so before I actually go into styles, I'm going to double check what our wireframe looks like. So we've got this wrappers around everything. We've got a header with an H1 in it, navigation with 3 links. So that's going to be really similar to your midterm main, has a couple paragraphs, and then we've got our footer. So we kind of have all of our key pieces that we really need to have for this. So I think we could go ahead and jump into our styles. So I want to start with the shadows. There is a box shadow and a text shadow. I think I'm gonna just jump straight into the examples that I have Your book does a really good job of giving information on these two. So we've got here CSS box shadow property, and what you have is you've got a couple of different values, and this is how you would write it, where you have box shadow and then you list the values, and it's implied that they go in this order. So first you have a horizontal offset, so how far to the right or left does your shadow differ from the original content. So if this is, now when it's talking about box, it's talking about the whole element as if it is a box. So if you have a whole item, how far to the right or left is it going to go? This is where I wish I had a dry erase board or something that I could draw on. But if you look at my cursor, the beginning point of a website and how you look at information, how you would graph it out. If you remember back to your, I don't know if this would be geometry class, where you would have quadrants and you would have two arrows going, multiple directions, and you would have that center axis where you have 0, 0. Let me see if I can find a. All right, so I'm not necessarily the most proficient person in the world when it comes to math, so please forgive me if I explain this in a way that's not necessarily the most accurate, but the point of what I wanted to talk about is when you are graphing things like this, you probably recognize this idea at least, where you have these two axes that are crossing over each other, and in the center is 0, 0, and then if you go up on the y-axis, that's positive, and if you go down on the y-axis, that's negative, and then if you go to the right on the x-axis, that's positive, and then if you go to the left, that's negative. So you're probably used to thinking of things in this way when you are thinking about the positive and negative area or space of something existing. Now, websites are a little bit different, and you'll actually notice this as well in some other programming languages if you ever do need to sort of map things on a screen. And that's that if you go to, so R00 is in the top of the browser window. So it would be not quite exactly where my pointer is, because, if I try to move it closer, it doesn't quite fit, but this would be 0, 0 essentially. And then as you move to the right, that's going to be positive. So like, let's say this is 100 pixels. I don't know what it actually would be, but let's say that's 100 pixels. That's 100 pixels to the right. And then if I move down, that's 100 pixels positive as well. So this location about here would be positive 100 on the x-axis and positive 100 on the y-axis. So negative would be moving to the left beyond my screen essentially, or let's say I move this. So negative would be coming off of the window over here some space. And you can have things exist negatively. They're just going to be kind of beyond what you see. And then negative would be going on the y-axis would be up here. So if we had negative 100, negative 100, it'd be somewhere out here. So it's not completely flipped, but it's a little bit different than we typically think about. And the reason I want to mention that is when you are working then with these coordinates, what this means is 5 pixels to the right, because that's our horizontal offset, and then we have 5 pixels down on our vertical offset. So it's moving in a positive direction, which for us is down. And then the next one, we've got blur radius optional, spread distance optional, and they're going to go in that order. So if you only have 3, it's going to assume that is a blur radius. And what I like about the examples on W3 Schools is you can change these values with what's already there, and you can kind of visualize it. So blur is going to kind of change the sharpness of the shadow. You can probably envision what that would look like. Spread distance is kind of interesting because it's basically saying, let's say your original container, let's say it's like a 50 pixel by 50 pixel box. You can change the size of your shadow. So you can basically say, I want my shadow to be the exact same size as the original object. I just want, it to move on the X and Y axis a little bit. Or you could say, I want the shadow to be a little smaller than the original box, or I want it to be a little bit bigger than the original box. And what that does is it changes the optical illusion that's being created, and it's saying information about the environment. And I'm putting that in air quotes. You can't really see that, but this is where it, to me at least, it starts connecting with drawing. Because when you're drawing, you're always trying to think about how to create the optical illusion of space. And I think a lot of times when we're thinking about things on screens and we're thinking about websites, we don't really think that there is a space there. But we can do a lot to imply space and to imply things about our environment. Even things like this little icon here, where it has this open close margin, there's a little drop shadow there. And so we have been trained that if there is a drop shadow, chances are that is something that is clickable. And part of it communicating that it's clickable is this idea that things that are static and flat, you can't do things with, you just read it, versus things like this that are a little button that have a drop shadow. We can kind of almost even picture, if I click my mouse button and I press down on it, then I can supposedly do the same thing with this three-dimensional thing and click on it. And we can do things with animation where we can actually make that button look like it is going down and kind of simulate that experience. And so it ties into our real life experience of content. Anyway, sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but spread distance is interesting because if you have a shadow that is smaller, that's telling us something about the environment, that it's very bright. And it also helps give a perspective of the angle of the thing that we're looking at. And then same thing too, if you have a very large shadow, that also is going to create is going to tell us something about the lighting and the space of what we're looking at. And that could help work in your favor in some way. But for the most part, you probably aren't going to really work too much with the spread distance. You probably are going to just have a shadow that's pretty much the same size as the original object. And then you might just have, like here you can see there's a bit of a blur because it softens as it changes that color. All right, so that's a box shadow. Oh, and then the last value is the color that you're going to have. So for text shadow, you have kind of similar things. You've got horizontal offset, so how far to the right or to the left. Vertical, how far up or down. Blur radius is still here because you can change how it is blurring and softening the boundary of it. But it doesn't have spread, so the size is always going to be the same as whatever the text was. And then you can also choose the color. So I've got examples here, and we can do the same order as what is introduced in the book. So CSS box shadow property. All right, so I'm just gonna click on this example. And what I like about this is it shows a couple of variations of working with this. So there is the box shadow with just a black box shadow, and then there's this gray one, and then there's a red one. And it's not the most interesting. I wish this example would show some of the other things, but that's the nice thing is I can go in and I can change, so I can put in 5 pixels. So that would be the blur. Let's actually start with that. All right, so what it's doing is it's going to be blurring the 5 pixels. You could try out different numbers so you can see like what happens with 2. And so it's kind of a smaller distance of the pixels. Kind of like 2 pixels are blurring versus 5 pixels. And then let's do something like 10. So you can see you can change kind of the basically the distance that it's blurring. Because if you only did 1 pixels, it's going to only be that outermost pixel that would be the range that it's blurring. Versus 2 pixels, the blurring is going to happen between that distance. 5 pixels is going to blur between the 5 pixels distance. And then let's do 5 pixels. Oh, whoops, sorry. 5 pixels. So this is saying I want the spread to basically be larger by 5. And we could also do the reverse. We could do negative. And so what it's doing is it's saying it's 5 pixels smaller than this original box. And then because this one is 10 pixels, we're able to see basically 5 pixels kind of still showing through, versus with this on the side basically being at 5 pixels, it's obscuring it. So it actually looks like there's light kind of coming in a little bit more from that side. And we could actually make this look a little bit more drastic, maybe like negative 15. And so it got to the point where we just can't see it at all, versus, let's say, at 20 pixels. So now we can see it again, but because the shadow is so small, it gives this illusion that the environment is really bright, and it's kind of letting light kind of spill in from the sides and help illuminate it. It also kind of helps make the illusion look like that item is sticking out further, because not only the distance, but it's basically saying there's nothing behind this because light can spill in behind it. So it looks less like a column, and it looks more like kind of a flat piece of paper. So there's a lot of things that you could do with the perspective on that, versus these look a lot flatter because there's not any real range to it. So you can play around with the position here. And so like this is a great way of being able to see. So negative 5 moves it over to the left. Do negative 20. It's going to flip it to the top side. And then we've got that 5 pixels is the blur, and then negative 15, that's that spread. This one is looking at the CSS text shadow. Oh, and this is a very weird example. I'm not sure why they picked these colors, but let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. So this actually brings up a really great conversation, and that is that typically speaking, things that are warmer colors on the color wheel, so red, orange, yellow, they have a tendency to visually pop out and kind of stand out, versus things that are cooler like blue, greens, purples, they have a tendency to recede. As far as black and white goes, it kind of depends a little bit on the context. It's a little bit more about the contrast. So if you had black and white, that would pop and stand out more, versus when, like, let's say that you were drawing and you were trying to create a picture where you were doing a perspective drawing, you would have a lot of contrast in the foreground of your drawing to make those things create the illusion of it coming towards you, versus things that you want to recede and kind of go to the background and stand out less. They have a tendency to look duller and have less contrast. So they might be a little bit cooler in color, but they might also be a little bit less brilliant, have less saturation, because saturation is something we've talked about. So they might be less saturated. They might be a little bit more gray. They're probably going to be less white, but they're also going to be less black. So you wouldn't have pure blacks or pure whites. You're going to kind of go a lot more towards those middle areas. And that helps push things back and create that illusion, because as we look at things in our own environment, we see things with a lot more clarity as it comes towards us. And then as things kind of go back into the distance, they start looking more hazy, they look more gray, and you can't see them as well. So it's the same thing when we are designing things like this, where things with red or like very clear color are going to pop towards us. So I would never recommend that you have a drop shadow be bright red like this, because it actually is creating this optical illusion where that red and the black are fighting with each other, because that red is trying to pop forward. And it's one of those reasons why if you've got like stop signs, construction signs, it's all those red, orange colors, because they're made to get your attention and to get you to look at them. So this is a really bad idea for text shadow because it's saying that this red is just as important as that text is. And especially with it being a serif font, just looking at it kind of gives me a bit of a headache. I don't know about you. So be mindful in the choices that you are making. But if you really wanted to have a shadow, it would make a lot more sense to pick a color that is cooler, that is less intense, that's going to be more gray, and it's not going to fight for attention. But we can play around with this. Now, usually these offsets, you're going to want to keep them smaller because if you go too large, you're actually going to have a really hard time having it be clear enough for you to actually read it. Because right now, the shadow is so far away from the original text that it's basically overlapping in so many different places that you really can't see it. So depending on the size, you might do like 1 or 2, but you're really not going to want to have more than that. And this already is a lot, I think, easier to read. But you could also do some things like, let's go ahead and add the blur. So this one we don't have spread, but we have the ability to add in a little bit of blur. And so that might help, so that way that shadow isn't fighting so much for attention. And maybe we could do a little bit of combination. So maybe have like 1 pixel vertical, so that way it's not getting too confusing where the bottom of the characters are. But then we can see it a little bit better stylistically wise with it on the X. So I think it actually looks better to have a larger number for the X value and then a smaller one for the Y. And then that blur I think is helping a lot, because if we were to remove this, it's just so harsh, that line, that it draws your eye to it. And again, to me at least, it gives me a bit of a headache to look at it because my brain's kind of a little confused. So, I mean, this looks better at least than where we started with this. What I'd like to do with this is, as we are talking about these, I just want to add them to our example. And we could just do something really similar to what there was. So we've gotten H1. H1, that would probably be a good place for us to put in a text shadow. And I kind of like that. Let's do 1 pixel or 2 pixels for the X, 1 pixel. We do 1 pixel blur. And then, let's see. What did we even have color-wise? I don't remember. Here we go. So we do have black text. We've got this blue, so I might go against my better judgment and do white. So this kind of goes back to that, conversation where white is going to pop forward. With black and white, it's kind of a toss-up in which will stand out more. Something that might work a little bit better is if we did, let's do like a light gray. It kind of defeats the purpose a little bit of having it necessarily have a shadow, but it does stand out more. And something like this where it's a serif font, I really wouldn't recommend adding too much detail to this on the off chance that it starts to get too distracting. All right, so that's going to be our text shadow. And then what we could do, this is basically what the book has you do, which is add a box shadow to the wrapper to get that to kind of separate a little bit. And let's just do 5 pixels. And I'm going to add a blur as well. And then, whoops, I'll just type in, let me think. I was going to say dark gray, but considering we have light blue and we have white, this might also make sense as light gray. Actually, I think let's do dark gray. I'll try not to go too much down the rabbit hole of playing around with these styles, but you can use whatever colors you want as you're playing around with this and kind of getting familiar with it. But this will just give us this light shadow. And this actually reminds me a little bit more of that button icon where they didn't want it to stand out too much. They just wanted it to be a little bit more subtle. I think that could actually be probably a little bit more dark, but it'll be fine. All right, so the next thing that I wanted to go over is I'm going to have us look at the book to look at an illustration of it, but that it's going to be background clip and background size. And I think the illustrations are really helpful. All right, so this is on page 196 if you want to look at this later in your own book. But now that we've started talking about working with images, basically this section is saying, now that you have images and you can apply them as this wallpaper essentially to a container, and now that you know that borders are a thing, now you can start thinking about how would you want those images to fill in the space. Do you want them to take up the same amount of space as the content? Do you want it to take up the same amount of space as the padding? Do you want it to even go behind the border? And that's what these three settings are. So with the background clip property, the default is the border box. It clips off the images displayed to fit the area behind the content, padding, and border. So it's going to go all the way behind. So if you had a border like this that was dashed, then that image would show behind it. If you had none, it would just show the picture kind of filling in that whole space. And so if for some reason you wanted, like if you had dash, if you wanted to have that border kind of go around it, then you would want to choose the background clip property and you'd want to set it to padding box. So that way it knows to include the padding area. And then if you don't want it to include the padding, then you would want to set the background clip to content box. So it gives you some more ways to customize it, which is really nice. And then next is the CSS background origin property. And these are put next to each other because they've got the same thing in common, where it's focusing on either the content, the padding, or the border. In this case, the default is the padding box. So it positions items relative to where the padding is. And again, it has some nice illustrations of this. Sorry that this probably looks a little bit small on your screen, but basically there's this little image and it's showing that if you were to set this to the content box as the value, then it's going to only fill in where there is the content, versus if you have the padding, it's going to fill in and line up with how far the padding goes. So basically just to the inside of the border. And then if it's set to the border box, it's actually going behind the border. So the border is actually going to cover part of it up. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It just depends on what you're going for. I think in this case, I think having a little bit of padding on the side of this and grouping these together, I think it looks really good together, and I think it makes sense for this particular example. While I've got the book open, I'm just going to kind of keep scrolling through this because I think just looking at the book for this will help illustrate things well enough. I don't have any pictures that I wanted to download for this particular example, so we're not going to be adding this into the examples. Now, CSS background and resize, these give you some more options of how you can work with your pictures. And so you can say, I want the size of that background as it is filling up the div. I want it to be a particular width or height. and you could say what those dimensions are going to be. And it says here, if only one percentage value is provided, the second value is going to default to auto. So you're going to see that in an example, both in the reading and then also with the homework. You can do percentages, you can do pixel values if you wanted to. And then there are these two values, which can be a little confusing, but that's where I really like the illustrations in the book. So this first one is looking at an example where you just have that background image and it's being applied as whatever the size of the actual image is. And so if you don't say how big you want it to be, then it would just show up that size. And then this is also where it's not repeating, you haven't changed the position, it's just kind of staying in that one particular area. And then what you could do is, like, let's say that you want to take a picture like this and you want it to resize and always just kind of fill in this header area that you might have on your website. Then you would say, I want the background size to be 100% for the width and 100% for the height, and it's just always going to fill up that space. Now you'll notice that for this picture, it doesn't necessarily look really great to skew the image really far one way or the other. And you'll notice that with the homework assignment. I've done something similar to this with the homework where I give you some pictures of the classroom and the hallway at the school, and as it resizes, it does start to look kind of goofy. And so you would want to do it in a way where you're kind of choosing wisely why you might want to do that. But I wanted you to be able to get a little bit of practice with it. So I included it anyways, even though it's not necessarily the best answer in a lot of cases. All right, so that's the background size property. And I've got two more ways of looking at it that I want to show you. So there is and you can kind of tell this based off the tab. So there is cover and there's contain, and they sound really similar, so it can be kind of confusing to figure out which is which. But basically with the cover, you have your set amount of content and you're saying, I want the image to completely cover all of the content, and I want it to kind of fill in that space. And so what is happening is the picture doesn't fit, and so whatever doesn't fit, it just gets cropped off. So you could think of cover as cropping, versus contain is saying, I want the original picture to be fully contained in the box. If the box is too tall and there's some content that isn't going to be covered, that's fine. But I want the picture to be fully contained inside of this div container that it's in. So you can either fully cover the space or you can fully contain the image, is kind of how you can kind of keep track of those. And you'll have some practice in the reading they'll help you with that. Now, the next thing that I wanted to go over, and we can do a little bit of this in our example, is working with opacity. And you might not be as familiar with the term opacity, but it's basically how transparent, how see-through something is. So if something is fully opaque, you can't see through it, versus if it is more on the transparent side of things, then you can kind of partially see things through other items. So in this image, they have black text over a white background, and they've changed the opacity so the image behind it is slightly showing through both the text and the background color. And that's one of the distinctions I'd really like to make about working with opacity is a thing that gets applied to whatever you're selecting. So whatever element or ID or class that is, it gets applied to that whole thing. So if you're applying it to something like this, it's going to always affect the text and the background color. And that's what I like about this picture, is it kind of helps illustrate that. Versus there is another way of working with opacity. And actually, let me see if I can find. So opacity is actually pretty straightforward. Opacity is just written as opacity for the property, and then for the value, it's on a scale of 0 to 1. So you can think of it as percentages. So this would be 60% opacity. And then you just kind of add it to whatever thing you want to style. Now there's this other concept, and that is working with RGBA or HSLA. And it's looking at red, green, blue, and then A stands for alpha. And the alpha channel is what helps to control the transparency. And that's something that if you are interested in working with like photo or video editing, you will encounter that a lot, especially if you're working with like green screen effects or anything where you're basically like changing the transparency of something. But you end up using it a lot when you're working with editing. Anyway, so what you do is, like, here we have these RGB values, and what you do is at the end of your numbers is you add one more value, and it's like the opacity number where it's on a scale of 0 to 1, and here it even says 0 is transparent, 1 is opaque. So here we have another example, and this one is focusing on just the text. So what is really great about working with RGBA or HSLA is because those can get applied as text color or background color, you can choose and you can say, I want this to only affect the, so in this case, they didn't have a background color. They just didn't specify one at all. And then they're saying that they want the text color to be RGBA, and then it's having it be slightly transparent. And so it's letting that texture from the image show through a little bit, and it's kind of mixing a little bit with that text. So it gives you a lot more options. And here's a good example where it shows, it's basically saying that sort of as like a fallback, if for some reason the opacity isn't able to be shown in an older browser, it'll just show as white. And it even says that here, older browsers will not understand the RGBA color. And that's part of this idea of working with CSS3 styles, is these are newer styles that are new to working with CSS3. Some of them might not be as supported in older browsers, and a lot of them have this tendency, at least these ones that we're covering, they kind of create these optical illusions of things being a little bit more three-dimensional. So they have this fallback, so that way if it can't be seen, it'll at least just be white. And then they're saying, okay, here I want RGBA to be white, but then I want there to be 80% opacity. And then they've got the rest of the styles. So that's something that we could probably go ahead and add to our example. The hardest thing is trying to think of like where is a good spot to make something transparent and have it actually work okay. We don't have any pictures, and so anything that happens is going to look more like color blending. So for example, with our background color for the wrapper, we have that set to white. So we could actually say, all right, I want that to be white, but then here I want the background color to be RGBA, and we'll keep the 255. And then I could just copy this straight from what we had in the book, basically 80% opacity. And so what that's going to do is it's making this background just, it's like 20% of the light blue is showing through. And essentially what I did is it looks more in this case like color mixing. It kind of looks like, well, that white color we had just now has a little bit more blue to it. So it's not necessarily doing a whole lot for us in this particular case, but it hopefully that still gets across the point. And then what we could do to illustrate opacity is here, if I say I want this to be 0.8, this is going to affect the whole paragraph. So it's going to affect the green, and it's going to also affect the black text. So if I hit save and refresh, and it also affected the border. So it's affecting the whole entire thing of it. And so if we did have a picture, it would, in the wrapper, it would be showing through. But again, because of how this is being shown, it's creating more of kind of like a color mixing sort of look where it's basically adding more white to both the text, the green background, and then also the border. So that's going to be working with opacity, and then also working with the alpha channel with RGBA and then HSLA. And HSLA would be written really the same way, where you would take the first couple of values and then at the end you would put your number. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to look at with all of you in this video is working with gradients. So there are two ways of being able to work with a gradient. You can work with a gradient as a linear change, so it's going to mean from one side to another side, or you can work with a gradient in a radial pattern, so radiating out from a spot, so kind of more of a circular sort of look to it. And for whatever reason, linear and radial gradients are added to background images. So what I want to do to set this up is I'm going to put the gradient, or at least one of them, I'm going to put in the body section. So usually what I would do, and I'm actually going to change these a little bit. I'm going to change this to, let me just say blue. And then I'm going to do our gradient. So you do background image. So for some reason, I'm not exactly sure why, gradients are treated as images. And I think it's just kind of the limitation to how gradients can really work. They sort of end up taking up kind of a specific amount of space. So when you're working with a linear gradient, you're going to specify that you want it to be a linear gradient, and then in parentheses, you're going to put what your values are, kind of like you would with an image. So you're going to say, I want to go to, and then you pick a direction. So I could say like to bottom. And then you're going to say the starting color, and I'm going to just say red, and then you say your ending color, and you do blue, or whatever color. And what I recommend is, I would recommend taking whatever color is going to turn into and putting that as a background color above it. And let me just switch this to, let's say like green, so you can see kind of how this works. So our color starts as red, and then it's going to go to blue. And then at some point, if you don't tell it to not repeat, it's going to end up repeating. And that's going to be another value. Whoops, background repeat. That's going to be another value you're often going to want to have, is tell it not to repeat. Unless you want it to. I think it tends to be a bit jarring if you repeat it. And then what happens is, wherever that sort of ends, a lot of times you'll end up having this other color. So if you don't specify the color, it might just look blank. So what I like to do is I like to take whatever color it's going to turn into, put that at the end, so then you're able to kind of more easily just transition between the colors. And depending on how far apart the colors are from each other, it's going to kind of change this gradient. Like red's not too far away. On the color wheel, orange is further. So if I said orange, it's going to kind of change how that gradient might look. All right, so the other one, let's just switch this real quick. So there's linear gradient. Oops. And then there is radial gradient. And for the radial gradient, you don't have to choose the direction, because it's just going to start from the center and then it's going to radiate outwards. And this one is a little harder to see because it's basically starting in the center. Now this one, I don't think having this background color looks very good. I'd probably suggest handling that in other ways. So the radial gradient, I think, would actually make a lot more sense for something that's smaller. So what I'm going to suggest is do linear gradient here. And then maybe we could actually do like a radial gradient with the H1 perhaps. So you can kind of see it a little bit better, and there might be better choices for this. For example, since we've got kind of this white color sort of thing going on, and we have the light blue or sort of the blue background, maybe it would actually make more sense to have this. Let's try doing what happens if we start at white, and then maybe we go from white to that background color we had. Was it 6666FF? So we could try that. And that actually doesn't look too bad. We could even maybe change the color around the text, so maybe it's a little bit darker so it kind of stands out from the white. But this actually looks kind of nice because it's a little bit more subtle. Now, as a whole website, I don't think that these individual pieces look very good together, but separately and in the right circumstances, I think you could do some really interesting things with this. So I'll be very curious to see kind of how everybody takes their midterm projects and kind of what direction you go in, and how you decide to illustrate your own sort of style and branding. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end this. We're going to continue with this example and how to work with your navigation as an unordered list, but I'm going to do that in the next video. So if you have any questions, you can add a comment to the discussion, or you can send me an email.